Should we start with fried? Do you like yours over easy or sunny side up?
Oh, sunny side up, I think, yeah. That's a good breakfast cooking sound, isn't it? Stand well back.
Hello and welcome to Crowd Science from the BBC World Service. I'm Anand Jagatia. We're devoting a whole episode to chicken and egg problems. And no, I'm not talking about causality dilemmas. I'm talking about questions that are quite literally about chickens and eggs. And that's why you can hear Marnie Chesterton frying up some breakfast with one of our listeners.
Susan, how do you think our egg is turning out?
Well, our egg's doing very well. I'm using a non-stick pan here and just a little drop of oil in it. And they're not sticking at all. As you can see, I'm moving them around the pan and they've cooked nicely. No problem.
They look delicious. They smell delicious.
Crowd Science is the show that explores your science conundrums. And it turns out that over the years we've had quite a lot of questions in the Crowd Science Egg Box, which is the special section of our inbox dedicated to egg-based inquiries. So coming up, I'll be looking at what happens to eggs after they've hatched, and investigating some curious behaviours in chickens, as well as working out how a cuckoo knows it's a cuckoo when it's been raised in another bird's nest. But first, Marnie is looking into some questions all about the science of cooking eggs. And speaking of, how are you getting on with that breakfast, Marnie? I ordered 2 fried eggs sunny side up, please.
Thanks, Anand. We'll get cracking with breakfast shortly. Now, I'm here at the home of listener Susan in London, who's invited us over not only to answer her question about eggs, but also to do some cooking. So, Susan, what is your question for Crowd Science, please?
Well, I find that often eggs that I buy have the remnants of chicken feces on them and maybe even bits of feathers, and that's the same whether they're free-range eggs or they're caged hen's eggs. So before cooking them, I often give them a good scrub. But I want to know whether we should actually wash or rinse our eggs before cooking or cracking them open in order to lower the risk of disease.
I love that you've asked this question, Susan, because you've actually landed on a raging international debate. And can I ask, you're not originally from the UK, are you?
No, I grew up in Canada.
OK, well, perhaps it's not surprising then that you feel inclined to wash your eggs, because Canada, as well as the US and Japan and a small number of other countries, they do wash their eggs if they're going to be commercially sold. Whereas over here in Europe and also in Africa, Latin America and Asia, we do not wash commercially sold eggs. Now, I don't know a lot about eggshells, so I spoke to egg expert Vincent Guionnet, who's a trained vet and poultry scientist. He's based in Canada, and he works with the poultry sector to try and promote the consumption of eggs. And I started by asking him a really basic question. How's the eggshell actually get on the outside of the egg?
Through the process, so the yolk is coming from the ovary and it's being expelled and it's going down the reproductive tract, and then you got the different layers that are being deposited. You got the egg white, and you got different layers of egg white, and at one point in the organism that we call either the uterus, that's the equivalent of the uterus, but it's also called the shell gland. That's where the shell is being deposited, and you got fluid coming surrounding the egg white, actually the egg white and the membrane, because you don't want to interfere. Those membrane are being deposited, and from the outer eggshell membrane starts the calcification process. First, the different sort of calcium, crystals, if you want to call them that way, starts to spread across horizontally, and then once they all touch each other and they have sort of gather, the whole surface of the egg, then they start growing sort of upwards, right? So that's the thickness of the shell. And it's done in, say, the hen is doing that every 20, 22 hours. It's amazing.
That is astonishing. Because I think I always assumed that there was some sort of mould that was egg-shaped. and then I couldn't work out why there wasn't a seam somewhere on the egg.
Yeah, no. I mean, everything is coming through the bloodstream, and it's all, so in liquid form, and it's just being converted. It's the beauty of nature and evolution, right?
So now we know a bit more about eggshells, I think it's time to crack one. So, Susan, do you want to go first or should I?
I'll crack one. Yeah,
Okay. I'm going to hand you some eggs.
Oh, thank you.
Now, this egg is from the UK, so it won't have been washed, but they do look clean.
They do. These ones look rather, well, some of them are more clean than others, but this one looks very clean. So I'm happy to have a go at that. I'll just be very careful. So shall I give this a go?
Go for it.
Great. That came out without even breaking the yolk.
Lovely. Okay, so those ones aren't particularly dirty, but I totally understand why you'd want to wash them if they did have some poo on them, particularly because eggshell is porous. But what natural protection does an egg have that means it's still safe to eat when it is unwashed? I quizzed Vincent on this one.
By design, by nature, over the years, the hen has developed a mechanism by laying on top of the calcium shell the cuticle, a very small layer that is designed to really protect at the very end of the egg formation and as the egg is coming out of the hen to protect from the environment, okay? And that cuticle is basically there to protect the eggs from bacteria that could penetrate inside the egg. And it's around the egg, and that's why when you look at an egg that is just being laid, it's fairly moist, right? Humid. That's that little cuticle that has been laid on top of the shell.
So that's a defense mechanism
yes,
that's already on the egg because that's what the hen does.
Correct. I mean, nature has done it so beautifully. Actually, for a long time, the cuticle, we did not really worry too much about what was the composition of the cuticle, but recent studies have shown that there's protein, there's carbohydrate, and some of those molecules actually have some antimicrobial activity. And you also have antimicrobial activity in other parts of the shell, around the shell membrane, all those different things. So the egg has been designed beautifully over the years to have a number of defense mechanisms against infection. Right? Infection, because as we know, the egg technically originally is to create an embryo and to develop a new chick, right? So the hen over centuries has developed all those different mechanisms that are deposited on the egg, inside the egg, and so forth.
How clever is that? I'd never heard of the cuticle before.
Neither had I, and I'd never really thought about how it happened, but it's absolutely fascinating.
There's just one final finishing touch that the hen does, just to make sure that the chick inside it is a little bit safer.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to know quite how effective this cuticle is.
Nature and the hen have already got this defensive layer, this cuticle, on an egg, and that stops the bacteria getting into the egg.
Yes, it stops at the early stages. So during what we call the oviposition of the release of the egg by the hen, and maybe for the first 48 to 72 hours. Okay, the cuticle over time is going to dry out a bit. And also the cuticle is going to start to let gas exchanges go through. So then potentially also bacteria could come through. So really the cuticle plays an important role, but not the most critical one. There's a number of processes that protects the egg from, contamination. So that role of the cuticle is probably during the first, 72 hours.
One other question that springs to mind is what happens to this cuticle when the egg is washed?
And does washing the eggs remove the cuticle?
Yeah, I mean, that's what happens. If you wash the egg, you remove the cuticle. But at what time do you remove the cuticle? And also, let's remember that nature has given the hen that cuticle, to coat the egg, but we have also a number of processes on farms to also avoid any contamination of the egg. So it's not that we solely rely on cuticle to provide safe eggs for consumers, right?
I think this is fascinating. So washing removes the cuticle, which is a layer of protection. So that's lost. And then one of the side effects of that is the egg may become drier because some of the moisture from inside the egg might get lost. So that means if you wash your eggs, you then should keep them in the refrigerator because that prevents the egg from losing water.
Right.
But what was gained by washing? Well, as Vincent said, the cuticle's protection, it doesn't sustain over time. It's a really short-term thing. So if an egg remains uncleaned and in contact with some poo on the surface of the egg, then there might be bacteria like Salmonella from the faeces, and that might get through the porous shell and contaminate the inside. Also, if you have Salmonella within the egg, it will multiply at room temperature much more than at refrigerated temperature, making it more likely to make you sick.
So even if you buy your eggs unwashed on ambient shells, it'd be a good thing to keep them in the fridge anyway.
Yeah.
Which is what I do.
Should you wash your eggs at home? Well, according to the US Department of Agriculture, that's not recommended because it may increase the risk of contamination, because the wash water can get drawn into the egg through the pores in the shell. Whereas when they do this in the commercial sector, they're washed in such a way to ensure egg safety. So, what are Vincent's conclusions after 30 years of working in the poultry sector?
So you've been exposed to both the washed egg and the unwashed egg system. Have you noticed any difference in quality or safety?
No, absolutely not. Really, it's different way to look at things, and both system works quite well, as we know, right, from data that is available in terms of food safety for that product.
What do you think, Susan?
Well, I think my approach probably is the safest, because I buy my eggs in this country off the shelf. They're not in a chilled section. They haven't been washed. I don't wash them when I bring them home. I put the cotton in the fridge, and when I get them out to use them, just before I use them, I rinse them off, or if necessary, scrub them a bit, before I actually crack them. And that's partly because when I'm cracking them, if the shell happens to fall into the pan and it's got stuff on it, then it's going to contaminate it. So I make sure it's clean just before I crack it.
That makes sense, because also, if you're going to wash it just before you use it, there's absolutely no time for any bacteria to get through the shell and contaminate the egg.
Absolutely. I mean, you just wash it and then you crack it. So that seems to work quite well so far. I haven't got ill on it anyway.
Congratulations. Should we celebrate by cooking some eggs?
Absolutely. Let's go for it.
Should we start with fried? Do you like yours over easy or sunny side up?
Oh, sunny side up, I think, yeah. Some onion, nice clean eggs, and another one. That's a good breakfast cooking sound, isn't it? Ooh. Stand well back.
Since we've got these things frying, I thought it might be good to hear a question from listener Bob, who's in the US.
Hi Crowd Science and hi Marnie. I am Bob in Olympia in Washington State in the USA. I often fry eggs and I'm wondering, what is the science behind the proper use of heat and oil in a frying pan so that the eggs do not stick? I find that if the pan and oil are properly preheated, the eggs fry nicely and do not stick, even in a stainless steel pan. When I was a kid, my parents had an old stove on which they did not have good control of the temperature. It seemed that the eggs would often stick. So what is the science behind properly frying an egg without it sticking?
So Bob wants to know about the science behind cooking a fried egg without it sticking. So, Susan, how do you think our egg is turning out?
Well, it's not sticking at all. But I do have a non-stick frying pan I'm using, and we just put just a tiny bit of oil in there as well.
They look delicious. They smell delicious. Well, let's hear some science, which might help us do even better on the next one. I spoke to someone who has 15 years of research experience into the science and technology of eggs.
My name is Valérie Le Chevalier. I am a lecturer in the School of Engineering in Rennes called AgroCampus West, and I'm teaching the science of food.
We have a question from Bob in the US. He said, what's the science behind the proper use of heat and oil in a frying pan so that eggs do not stick?
Well, when you add oil, you add a physical layer that prevents eggs from sticking on the pan. Anyway, if you have a good pan, something like a Tefal pan, you don't really need this oil because the pan is already hydrophobic. what you do when you add oil is just to add a hydrophobic layer. And the thing is that when you jellify egg, when you eat it, the protein are denatured and they expose hydrophobic groups, and this can react with the pan if the pan is quite old. And if you add the layer of oil, then it will prevent the protein with sticking on the pan.
So Valerie explained to me that when you heat the egg, the proteins in the egg white will denature and their compact structure will change and become more unravelled. So when we fry the egg, more of these proteins will denature and they form actually a gel. That's what I think of as the cooked egg. They form this gel because their unravelled structure forms networks, sort of series of nets. And so as this gel forms, the egg whites lose their transparency and they lose this ability to flow about because they become more solid. And the higher the temperature, the stickier the egg white will become. So a lower temperature is better for frying eggs that won't stick.
Well, egg white protein can denature about 63 degrees. So it's quite cold. The higher the temperature, the more you denature the protein and the more you expose the hydrophobic part. The more you have the hydrophobic part, the more you are sticky.
What Valerie's saying is the more you denature the protein, the stickier the egg will become. Now, as the proteins denature, they will expose chemical groups. Valerie was talking about them as hydrophilic and hydrophobic. Now, good non-stick pans, like the one you've got, Susan, will have chemical groups on their surface that don't interact with the chemical groups on the egg protein. So that means they won't stick. However, if you've got pans that are not non-stick, or they're a bit older and maybe bashed about a bit, the chemical groups on the egg white proteins may form bonds with the actual surface of the pan. So to avoid that, you need oil, which can act as an intermediate layer, preventing the protein from sticking to the pan. For our next fried egg, we want to go with not too high a temperature and a good amount of oil in order to prevent our egg whites from forming bonds with the pan. Now, maybe we could do some scrambled eggs because they're notorious for sticking to pans. So should we have a go with that?
Definitely.
Susan, how do you like your scrambled eggs?
Well, I like them both ways, really. I sometimes like them quite dry, and particularly if I'm having them just eggs on their own. But if I'm going to have them on toast, I like them a bit softer. And so I might put a bit of milk in it. But these ones were doing very nicely. And they're just coming up nice and scrambled, and they're going to be nice and dry, but also creamy.
Susan, whilst you deal with the scrambled eggs, I'm going to turn to boiled eggs because we've had a question from a listener who's having some problems removing the eggshell.
Hi Crowd Science, hi Marnie, it's Steve from the Lake District in England. Now I'm here in my kitchen at work and I'm preparing all the day's fresh fillings and soups because I run a sandwich bar. I've got a pan of about 50 eggs on the stove. Ooh, just coming up to the boil now. I'm going to cook them just for a few minutes and then cool them under running cold water so they don't overcook. Then we're going to shell them, we're going to grate them, we're going to mix them with a touch of pepper, some lemon, Dijon, and of course some mayonnaise to make a nice fresh egg mayonnaise for the sandwich fillings. I do this every single day, 50, 60, 70 eggs at a time. And they're all cooked the same, they're all cooled the same, but when I come to peel them, some of these eggs, they just pop straight out of the shell. The other ones, painstaking. You have to take it shard by shard by shard. It's as if the shell doesn't want to come off the egg. Why is it? Some eggs are really easy to peel and others are an absolute nightmare.
We need to find Steve a solution because struggling to shell 50 odd boiled eggs each day really isn't sustainable. I suspected the answer might be something to do with the age of the eggs, so I asked Vincent what he thought.
A fresh egg, if you boil a fresh egg and try to remove the shell, it's going to be extremely hard, right? Because you have the shell, you have those shell membrane. You know, when you peel an egg, you're going to see that little membrane just below. So that's the shell membrane. That's the membrane that is basically at the basis for the formation of the shell. And in a fresh egg, it's very attached to both the shell and the egg white surrounding it, right? So it's very hard to peel. If you let the egg age for about, say, 7 days, then you have that exchange of gases, so the egg is losing a bit of water. Therefore, now there's more room, and that membrane is starting to detach a bit from the shell. And therefore, when you boil them, it's much easier to do.
You've got the shell, you've got this membrane, and then you've got CO2 that's inside the egg in the albumen itself, and then you're losing the CO2, right?
Right.
What's that doing to the membrane?
It's modifying the pH by losing the CO2, right? So the proteins, and the membrane is rich in proteins and different, binding between different proteins. The structure of the molecules change, right? The conformation of the molecules. And therefore that membrane starts to be more loose. And that's how you can, it's easier to peel.
So there you go, Steve. Vincent recommends that you leave your eggs for 7 days before boiling them, as this should give them enough time to lose a bit of CO2 and water, which causes the shell membrane to become less attached to both the shell and the egg white. Now, Susan and I each have a boiled egg. Shall we try and see how easy these ones are to shell?
Okay, have a go.
These ones are only just bought, so they might be quite fresh and so a bit tricky. So while we struggle with this, let's check in with Anand, who's looking into a case of curious chicken behaviour.
Well, good luck with that fiddly task, Marnie, and thanks to Susan, Steve and Bob for your questions. This is Crowd Science from the BBC World Service, where we're unscrambling the science behind your questions about eggs. That is the sound of chickens that belong to one of our listeners, Laurie, in France. He wrote to us because he noticed something rather strange about the behaviour of 2 of his chickens after they hatched.
I've had chickens for the last 10 years, and finally one became broody a couple of years ago and started sitting on her eggs. But obviously, because I only had hens, I knew those eggs had not been fertilised. So my sister and her boyfriend have chickens with cockerels, and so I swapped my non-fertilised eggs for them to eat, and they gave me their possibly fertilised eggs, which I put under Mary. She's called Mary because of virgin births, obviously.
Okay, so Mary's the chicken, yeah?
Yeah, so Mary's the chicken and Josephine was her sister, as it were. And when she did the 3 weeks of sitting, 2 of the eggs hatched, and she's white and so is Josephine, but the 2 that hatched, one was black and one was brown. And that's because my sister has a lot of black and brown chickens. And when the chickens were real babies, they'd all sleep in the coop together with the 2 adults. But as soon as they were able to fly, they flew up into the tree above when they wanted to roost. And that's what my sister's chickens do. They sleep in the tree. And the daft thing is, they get up in the morning, and when they want to lay an egg, when they're 3 months old, 4 months old, they decide to lay an egg, but they sleep in the tree, and they still use the coop to lay their eggs. But the 2 babies, one is chicken Kiev, and the other one's coq au vin.
I bet you had a lot of fun coming up with those names.
Oh man, that was my nephew's fault.
Okay, so chicken Kiev and coq au vin came from different chickens, but they seem to have the behaviours from their biological parents and not from Mary and Josephine.
Precisely. The last time these chickens met their parents was when they were in the egg. And literally less than a day. They were still warm from being laid. So how on earth did they get the nature characteristic of their parents, meaning they flew up into the tree when the only 2 chickens they'd ever met always slept in the coop?
So you're wondering where this behaviour has come from, if it's not been taught, if they haven't learnt it from, their parents that do fly up into the tree because they weren't hatched there. Where's it come from?
Indeed. The nature versus nurture thing is always really interesting, but how on earth does that happen? I mean, if I'd never seen a game of football, could I suddenly be absolutely wonderful at football because it just so happened that my granddad was George Best, even though I'd never met him and I'd never played football before? Because that's what's actually happening.
Yeah, maybe some chickens are just naturally, maybe there's variation in how brave or how curious different species of chickens are, and some of them might want to stay, relatively safe inside the coop and not fly away, and others of them might just have a tendency to do that. And maybe you've swapped them in for some more bold, more adventurous ones.
One French farmer told me that the brown ones and the black ones actually come from up in the mountains, and they all sleep in the trees. Once you get past a certain altitude, they all sleep in the trees. And he said he thought it was because there used to be wolves up there, and their predators were all on the ground. So they started sleeping in the trees like from day one up there.
Well, I think there's probably some really fascinating avian science in there. So yeah, we'll have to find out for you, Laurie.
That sounds great.
Yeah, thanks so much for sending in your question. I love it. So to recap, Laurie took 2 fertilised eggs from his sister's farm and put them underneath his own hens, Mary and Josephine, who have always slept inside the chicken coop. When the eggs hatched, these adopted chickens, Kiev and Ovan, flew up into a tree to go to sleep, just like their biological parents. But they'd never met these parents, so how on earth did they learn to do this? Sounds like we need to speak to a chicken behaviour expert.
My name is Siobhan Abbey-Singer. I'm a senior lecturer at the Royal Veterinary College in London, and I am also, hopefully, an expert in particular in chicken behaviour and cognition and welfare.
So we sort of filled you in on Laurie's situation with his chickens. What do you make of that situation? What do you think the explanation is for that?
It's a really good question, actually. I really was happy to see it. So effectively, the perching behaviour in chickens is at least in part genetically programmed. So chickens will automatically have a motivation to perch, and this is because the ancestor of the chicken, the red jungle fowl, was a bird that had predators that were ground dwelling and predators that were in the air, and they evolved perching in trees as an anti-predator mechanism because it's harder to get at them. One thing that's going on then is that the chicks that hatched will have had an instinct to want to perch. But there's also a developmental aspect, both in terms of learning and in terms of physical development. So as birds age, it's only after about the first week that they start to get, that they're fully feathered enough and have their tails enough to kind of get off the ground. And so once they can do that, they will start perching on initially low heights and then increase their height, sort of develop their musculature and motor skills. But at the same time, it seems that they really need to have some kind of complexity in their environment that involves 3D space and perches and items at different heights for them to be able to develop their spatial awareness.
Right, okay, so chickens have a sort of innate potential that means that they can jump up and fly up onto perches like trees in Laurie's case. But in that case then, if perching is an instinct, then why do you think Laurie's original chickens, Mary and Josephine, prefer not to sleep in the tree and stay in the coop?
We obviously don't know about the history of Laurie's first 2 birds. It may be that they didn't really have much experience of these perches or elevated structures when they were younger, and so they didn't really develop either the motor ability or the spatial awareness to get up on the perches. But we also know that there are some differences between strains in motivation and also physical ability to get on the perch. If they're heavier, they may find it's harder to get up from the ground also.
So really then, actually, it's even though Laurie was quite amazed by the fact that this difference in behaviour seemed to play out in his garden, it's actually not surprising that his new adopted chickens sleep in the tree, because it's kind of this anti-predator mechanism that's been around for a long time.
Yes, absolutely. Even within chickens, they're all individuals. They're all different. So, there is room for them to have different preferences about how they use their environment. It seems like his new chicks were potentially a different breed as well, who may also have had a different propensity, if you like, to perch to the original birds also.
So it seems like Kiev and Ovan were actually just acting out a very common chicken instinct to fly up into trees to avoid predators. Perhaps the real question is actually, why don't Mary and Josephine do this? Well, it could be because they're of a breed that's less likely to perch in the first place, or because of differences in the way they were brought up. When I was talking to Laurie about his chickens, he said that they made him think of another bird.
Cuckoos does a very similar thing. She lays the egg and she's on her way back to Africa before that egg comes anywhere near hatching, and yet when it hatches and becomes an adult, it flies to Africa.
And we've had a question all about cuckoo behaviour from another one of our listeners, Todd in Australia.
Hi, my name's Todd. I'm from Canberra in Australia. I'm a bit of a bird fanatic and like taking photos of a lot of birds. And the question occurred to me as to cuckoo species. We have quite a few cuckoo species in Australia, including one that's rather loud and annoying called a cole. So these coles in Australia, they're like large black birds, the males are, and the females are a sort of brown bird. And they're really quite big birds compared to the host parents that usually raise the chicks. It occurred to me that, how do they know that they're cuckoos, and how do they know that they're not the bird that raised them? How do they know to kick other eggs out of the nests? Those sort of things.
As Todd mentioned, cuckoos famously lay their eggs inside the nests of other bird species, who then raise the cuckoo as their own. But how does the baby cuckoo know how to act like a cuckoo and not like its host species? To find out, I spoke to Dr. Ros Gloag from the University of Sydney.
I am a biologist. I work at the University of Sydney in Australia. And my field is evolutionary ecology. And I have worked and do work on brood parasitic birds. So that includes cuckoos and other things which are not cuckoos but which have the same reproductive habits. So they lay their eggs in the nests of other species.
So, Ros, cuckoos have this, they're famous for this behaviour where they lay their eggs in other birds' nests, and then rather brutally the cuckoo hatches and kicks all of the other birds out of the nest. What's going on there? What is that? What's going on with that behaviour?
Yeah, so this is a behaviour that we'll refer to as brood parasitic. And the parasitism part is because the cuckoo is getting a free ride, and we can think of it as kind of parasitising the parental care behaviour of another species, so another bird. And so, cuckoos have completely lost the ability to build a nest and rear their own offspring. They are completely reliant on these other species, the host species, to rear their offspring for them. And they've evolved this whole kind of suite of behaviours that go along with that.
So our listener, Todd, who is also based in Australia, where there are lots of cuckoos near where he lives, he is kind of wondering how this behaviour works. How does the cuckoo know what to do, essentially? So when the cuckoo actually hatches in the first place, what happens to it then, and how does it know it's a cuckoo and not, it doesn't belong to the species of the brood that it's hatched into?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's tricky to start talking about what a cuckoo knows and doesn't know. But it's perfectly sensible to think about, wouldn't this cuckoo run into problems later? For example, if it grows up to an adult cuckoo and, for example, instead of, trying to court the females of other cuckoos, it makes a mistake and is attracted to, the host species or something. You can see some downstream problems if they kind of imprint on their host, or if they start acting more like their host than like a cuckoo. But these things are not not the problems that I think we often assume they are as humans. You know, we as humans, a lot of our behaviours are learned, and a lot of them learned, you know, in our childhood, so when we're young. But that's not true for many other animals, including cuckoos. So really their cuckoo-ness is hardwired into them. It's what we would call a kind of innate or instinctual behaviour. And a cuckoo is going to grow up to do cuckoo things and act like a cuckoo, irrespective of the nest or the species that they are reared in for those first few weeks of their life.
Okay, so it's about instinct. One of the most kind of famous behaviours that the cuckoos will exhibit is pushing the other birds out of the nest. So that behaviour then is an instinct.
That one absolutely is also an instinct, and it's quite interesting. I mean, I should start by saying not all cuckoos do this, but quite a few do. This very kind of stylized behaviour that they show in the first few days of life, where they push and they wriggle, and if they come into contact with something else, it might be the egg or a previously hatched chick of the host species that's in the same nest as it. It just kind of keeps wriggling and arching its back, and with a bit of persistence, it'll manage to toss them out of the nest. And maybe it all looks very deliberate if you see it on film, but in fact, it's really just going through this kind of stylized motion, almost like a reflex. And even if there are no other eggs in the nest, you might see a cuckoo kind of arching its back in that way. Or if you put things in the nest that are not other chicks or cuckoos, you can see it will have the same behaviour. And it's also, interestingly, something that is quite short-lived. So when the cuckoo gets to about 4 days kind of post-hatch, it stops doing that. So if it's failed to evict a host chick by that stage, it will just put up with it. So that kind of reflex just disappears. And, you know, it's not so unusual, these kind of reflexes, which have very specific kind of temporal component where they just appear during the certain period of life. And humans have these too. I have a newborn baby, and he shows this kind of really classic Moro reflex or startle reflex, which all human newborns have. And they'll start doing it, you know, from birth, where if they kind of get a bit of a shock, they throw their arms up. But that startle reflex just goes away after a few months of age. What the cuckoo chick is doing, that kind of reflex, that classic behaviour, wriggling to get other chicks out of the nest, it's temporary, and it's absolutely, hardwired in there as a innate behaviour.
Right, okay. And it can, I suppose it seems like a really complicated behaviour and outcome, right? If we kind of frame it in human terms and say, oh, well, the cuckoos have evolved to learn to push other birds out of the nest, it sounds, you know, quite nefarious, and it kind of implies a certain amount of like agency and all the rest of it. But actually, when you break it down to the behaviour, it's just, well, for 4 days, they just wriggle around until they bump into anything and then keep wriggling. Then you can see how actually quite a complicated set of behaviours can emerge from, you know, probably a behaviour that's pretty simple to evolve.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yep, I think that's right.
As humans, we have long childhoods, so a lot of our behaviour is learnt across that time. Many birds, on the other hand, like the cuckoo, rely a lot more on instinct, which can actually control some pretty sophisticated behaviours. Thanks to Todd and Laurie for your egg-centric questions about eccentric bird behaviour. Now let's get back to Marnie and see how her and listener Susan are getting on with those eggs.
Cheers, Anand. They were egg-exceptional. However, I've just spotted our pile of washing up. So, while I go and get started on that, let's hear from our listeners with the credits.
That's all for this edition of Crowd Science from the BBC World Service. This week's questions were from me, Laurie, in France.
Me, Todd, in Australia.
Me, Bob, in Olympia in Washington State, USA.
Me, Steve in England.
And me, Susan in London. This episode was presented by Marnie Chesterton and Anand Jagatia, and was produced by Jonathan Blackwell. If you have a question about science, please email crowdscience@bbc.co.uk. Thanks for listening, and we hope you found this episode cracking.
Oh, don't you start. That's quite enough egg puns for one episode, thank you.